In medieval times, life was measured by labor, and hunger was a constant companion. For most people, survival was not about ambition, leisure, or comfort. It was about securing enough food to live another day. Hunger was subtle, persistent, and often unbearable, shaping every decision, every movement, and every thought. It was not the occasional pang that modern people understand, but a background presence, always whispering that one must work, one must endure, one must survive. Fields were the stage of daily life. Dawn arrived with the first tasks, feeding animals, tending crops, and preparing for the long hours ahead. Men, women, and children alike worked from sunrise to sunset, their bodies attuned to the rhythm of labor. Tools were simple hoes, plows, sickles, and rakes. There were no tractors, no modern irrigation, no fertilizers. Every effort relied on human and animal strength, patience, and careful observation of the land. Plowing was a slow, exhausting task. Wooden plows pulled by oxen tore through soil that could be rocky, uneven, or waterlogged. Each furrow demanded strength and concentration. Sweat drenched clothing, and the cold or sun pierced the skin depending on the season. Even small mistakes, tilting the plow, misjudging the soil, could ruin part of the field, leaving less for harvest and more for worry. Planting required care and precision. Seeds were sown by hand, scattered carefully to ensure growth. If scattered too thickly, plants would compete and yield less. Too thinly, and the harvest would be insufficient. Nature was both guide and enemy. Rain, sun, frost, or drought determined the outcome. The medieval farmer could guess, plan, and hope, but ultimate control was impossible. Harvesting was perhaps the most demanding task. Grains, vegetables, and fruits had to be gathered by hand. The sickle cut slowly, each stroke repetitive, each movement exhausting. Children joined adults, their small hands working tirelessly. Hunger gnawed quietly, yet work could not pause. Food scarcity meant that every crop, every vegetable, every seed counted. Loss was not an inconvenience, it was a threat to survival. Labor was not limited to fields. Domestic work consumed energy from morning until night. Women cooked over open fires, prepared meals, fetched water, and managed the household. Cooking involved more than throwing ingredients into a pot. Grains had to be ground, soup stirred slowly over flames, and bread kneaded and baked in clay ovens. Firewood had to be gathered from forests, sometimes kilometers away, carried home and stored. Water was precious. Wells might be distant, rivers dangerous, and rainwater scarce. Washing clothes, preparing all depended on this finite resource. Every drop required effort to fetch. Even brief access to clean water became a small triumph in a world dominated by toil. Children contributed to labor as soon as they could walk. Fetching water, tending animals, weeding fields, and caring for younger siblings became their education. Play existed in small bursts, but it was a luxury. Work shaped their muscles, their endurance, and their understanding of responsibility far earlier than in modern times. Hunger dictated behavior, relationships, and emotional life. Meals were often monotonous: porridge, bread, vegetables, and occasionally meat. The wealthy enjoyed variety and abundance, peasants knew scarcity, repetition, and unpredictability. Even a single spoiled loaf could mean missed nourishment for a day. People ate slowly, mindfully, appreciating every crumb, because every bite mattered. Food scarcity was amplified by storage challenges. Without modern refrigeration, grain, vegetables, and meat had limited longevity. Mold, pests, and weather damaged supplies. Drought could destroy fields, floods could wash away crops. Hunger was not occasional. It was a persistent companion, shaping fear, patience, and endurance. Labor, hunger, and survival intertwined with the passage of time. Days were predictable in routine but unpredictable in outcome. Famine and shortage could strike suddenly, altering weeks of effort in an instant. People lived in cycles dictated by seasons, the moon and weather, always aware of scarcity and risk. Even the strongest adults felt the constant strain of hunger and labor. Weakness crept into muscles, making work slower and more dangerous. Accidents increased. Illnesses spread more easily among malnourished bodies. Each day's labor was both necessary and perilous, demanding resilience and careful attention. Communities relied on mutual aid. Families and neighbors worked together in fields, shared food during scarcity, and provided emotional support. Yet scarcity bred tension too. Jealousy, competition, and fear were always present. Sharing was a necessity, not always a choice. Survival required cooperation and quiet vigilance. Hunger shaped mental life. People thought about the next meal, the next harvest, the next season constantly. Planning and hope were intertwined with fear and endurance. Even brief relief, finding edible roots, trading with a neighbor, or a small harvest, offered profound satisfaction. Life's sweetness was measured in small victories. Evenings offered little rest. The body was exhausted, the stomach often empty, and the mind alert to danger. Families gathered around fires, shared what little food was available, and prepared for another day. Sleep came in small doses, interrupted by discomfort, cold, or anxiety. The day ended as it began. Quietly, slowly, and with the knowledge that survival depended on repeating the cycle again tomorrow. Labor and hunger were not just physical, they shaped social hierarchy. Lords, clergy, and merchants observed and dictated. Peasants labored under taxation, tithes, and obligation. The strong or wealthy might avoid some toil. The poor had little choice. Authority dictated work, but nature demanded it. One could not escape the grind. Even leisure was shaped by labor. Moments of rest or play were brief, often dictated by necessity or superstition. Laughter, storytelling, and games existed as brief respites in the long rhythm of toil. Joy was present, but quiet, temporary, and measured against survival. Hunger also influenced moral life. Stealing, poaching, or bending rules could be driven by necessity. Survival justified small transgressions, yet punishment for being caught could be severe. Fear and endurance coexisted. People balanced survival with obedience, strategy, and caution daily. The body's endurance was extraordinary. Blisters, sores, fatigue, and hunger were constant. People carried physical suffering silently, adapting to discomfort as natural. Weakness was dangerous, both socially and physically. Adaptation became instinctive. Labor and hunger shaped identity. People defined themselves by resilience, ability to endure, and skill in managing scarcity. Strength, patience, and intelligence were measured not by wealth, but by the quiet success of survival. Every successful harvest, every shared meal, every day survived quietly reinforced their place in life's fragile balance. Even in the most desperate conditions, hope persisted. Faith, community, and occasional abundance offered motivation. The next season might be better. A small crop could bring relief. Survival itself was a triumph. People endured not only out of necessity, but also out of quiet determination to continue life despite hardship. Thus medieval life began and ended with hunger and labor. Every day, people rose with effort and necessity, worked under threat and fatigue, and rested briefly, only to repeat the cycle. Hunger was a constant teacher. Labor a relentless companion, and survival the only metric that mattered. Quiet endurance shaped minds, bodies, and communities alike. Life was hard, slow, and repetitive. But it was also persistent, adaptive, and profoundly human. The ordinary medieval person unknown to history books exemplified quiet resilience in the face of endless toil and unrelenting hunger. Their days were unremarkable to outsiders, yet filled with small, persistent victories. Every meal earned, every harvest gathered, every night survived. In medieval times, health was fragile, and disease was a quiet, ever-present companion. Life was measured not only by labor and hunger, but by the constant risk of illness. Without modern medicine, sanitation, or understanding of germs, people lived under a shadow of vulnerability, unaware of how invisible forces could claim life or cripple the body. Water and hygiene were central to vulnerability. Clean water was scarce. Wells could be contaminated, rivers polluted, and rainwater limited. Washing the body or clothes was rare, time-consuming, and laborious. Dirt, sweat, and grime became part of daily life, both tolerated and unavoidable. Parasites thrived, lice, fleas and worms were companions from childhood. Their presence caused discomfort, itching, and disease, yet few could remove them effectively. Sewage and waste were managed poorly, if at all. Chamber pots were emptied into streets or open pits. Rain spread filth into homes, streets and fields. In towns, smells were strong and pervasive. Flies carried disease. People were constantly exposed to bacteria without realizing it. Sanitation was a slow and direct enemy. Infections were common. Small cuts, scrapes, or burns could fester into dangerous wounds. Without antiseptics or antibiotics, minor injuries could become fatal. People learned to treat wounds with herbs, oils, or prayers, but remedies were limited in effectiveness. Illnesses that are mild today, like a simple fever, could become life-threatening. Plagues were terrifying, recurring, and indiscriminate. The Black Death, although sporadic in occurrence, demonstrated how quickly disease could wipe out entire villages. Even minor outbreaks caused fear. Knowledge of causes was limited. People blamed divine wrath, bad air, or curses. Prevention was largely ritualistic prayers, charms and avoidance of the sick. Understanding of contagion was minimal, and methods of protection were unreliable. Childhood was especially perilous. Infants and young children were vulnerable to malnutrition, exposure, and disease. Many did not survive beyond early years. Those who did carried lifelong weaknesses from inadequate nutrition and repeated illness. Families grieved quietly, understanding that death was often beyond their control. Nutrition and disease were intertwined. Scarcity of food weakened the immune system. Poor diets, often limited to grains and vegetables, could not prevent anemia or other deficiencies. Children, women, and laboring adults suffered most. Hunger and illness reinforced each other, creating cycles of vulnerability. Workplaces were also breeding grounds for disease. Fields, workshops and homes were crowded, dusty and unsanitary. Animal husbandry introduced zoonotic risks. Livestock shared living spaces or were handled frequently, increasing exposure to pathogens. Diseases like anthrax, tuberculosis, and respiratory infections were common. Medical knowledge was rudimentary. Barber, surgeons, herbalists, and wise women offered remedies based on tradition, observation, or superstition. Bloodletting, poultices, and herbal teas were applied for various ailments, with inconsistent results. Surgery was risky, unhygienic, and often fatal. Yet these practitioners were essential, even if their effectiveness was limited. Plagues, fevers, and respiratory illnesses were frightening, because they could strike suddenly and indiscriminately. People observed patterns they did not fully understand. Quarantines were improvised, isolation was difficult. Fear of infection shaped daily routines quietly. People avoided crowds or the sick when possible, yet social labor and religious obligations often forced contact. Sanitation challenges extended to food preparation. Food was rarely cleaned thoroughly. Meat, grains, and vegetables could harbor bacteria. Cooking killed some pathogens, but improper storage or handling introduced contamination. Illness could strike at any meal, leaving families weakened and fearful. Sleep, often already brief due to labor and hunger, became more crucial but less restorative when illness was present. Fever, chills, or discomfort interrupted rest. Exhaustion compounded vulnerability. Even recovery from minor illness was slow, as nutrition and rest were insufficient to restore strength quickly. Mental health, though rarely discussed, was affected. Constant exposure to illness, death, and physical suffering created anxiety, fatigue, and quiet despair. Fear of disease guided behavior, influenced social interactions, and shaped children's upbringing. Observation of illness from infancy normalized the fragility of the body. Pregnancy and childbirth were particularly dangerous. Women faced high mortality rates, both from infection and complications. Infants were similarly vulnerable. Birth was performed with minimal hygiene, limited assistance, and a high risk of infection. Every birth carried risk not just for the mother, but for the family's survival and labor capacity. Communities adapted strategies to cope. Herbal remedies, seasonal observation and experience-based practices guided responses to illness. Isolation prayer and community care offered partial protection. Yet knowledge was limited, and life remained fragile. Illness shaped relationships, those sick relied on family and neighbors, creating quiet bonds of care amidst hardship. Even for the wealthy, disease was not distant. Urbanization, travel, and trade brought exposure to new pathogens. Crowds in towns and markets increased risk. Hospitals and care facilities were rudimentary, often religiously controlled, and only partially effective. No one was entirely safe, although social status could provide marginal advantages. Hunger, labor, and disease combined into an unrelenting cycle. Malnutrition weakened the body. Exposure to elements allowed illness, and wounds or infections slowed labor. Every task carried risk. Every day demanded vigilance and endurance. Survival depended on careful balance, quiet observation, and resilience. Faith and ritual were intertwined with health. Prayers, charms, and religious observances were seen as protection against illness. Clergy often provided guidance, blessing, and care. Spiritual reassurance offered comfort, even if medical efficacy was limited. Belief was both a psychological shield and a cultural necessity. Despite the pervasive risks, people persisted. Daily life required work, observation, and adaptation. Small victories, recovery from minor illness, survival through a season, or the health of a child, were celebrated quietly. Life itself was both fragile and precious, demanding endurance and patience. In medieval society, health was never guaranteed. The body was vulnerable, the environment unforgiving, and knowledge limited. Illness could strike without warning, reshape daily life, and claim life suddenly. The fragile balance between survival and disease shaped the rhythm of existence, the quality of labor, and the quiet endurance that defined everyday life. Even in the darkest moments, medieval people found ways to cope. Herbal remedies, family prayer, and communal support offered some protection. Awareness of fragility created resilience. Bodies and minds adapted to discomfort and uncertainty. Disease and hygiene intertwined with labor, hunger, and social obligations defined medieval existence. Health was a daily concern, a fragile advantage, and a constant challenge. People lived alongside illness, accepted risk, and endured quietly, relying on endurance, experience, and faith to navigate the uncertainties of life. In medieval times, shelter was neither comfortable nor permanent. Homes were simple, functional, and dictated by necessity rather than desire. For peasants, laborers, and even some townspeople, protection from weather, animals, and the cold was fragile and basic. Life revolved around the struggle to stay warm, dry, and safe. Most common homes were small, single-room structures made from wattle and daub, wood or stone. Walls were thin. Roofs were thatched or wooden, leaky during storms and susceptible to decay. Floors were dirt, sometimes covered with straw for insulation. Furniture was minimal: a few benches, a table, a bed, or a straw-filled mattress. Comfort was a distant luxury. Heating was primitive. Fires were central to survival, cooking and warmth. Open hearths were smoky, filled rooms with ash, soot and smoke. Chimneys were rare. Houses often smelled strongly of wood smoke, animals and dampness. Cold winters were relentless, penetrating thin walls and limited clothing. Survival depended on layering garments, maintaining fires, and close sleeping arrangements. Clothing was as much protection as it was identity. Peasants wore wool or coarse linen, patched repeatedly to extend use. Shoes were basic, often leather with minimal soles. Children wore hand-me-downs, frequently ill-fitting and worn thin. Even in towns, clothing reflected status. Wealthy people wore richer fabrics, dyed bright colors, and layered garments for warmth and display. But luxury came with burden: heavy, cumbersome and difficult to maintain. Work dictated attire. Laborers wore practical clothing suited for fields or workshops. Women's garments restricted mobility yet were necessary for modesty and social expectation. Men labored in tunics, trousers, and sometimes rough cloaks, enduring discomfort and restriction. Clothing was rarely changed or washed frequently, increasing discomfort and exposure to disease and parasites. Houses often lacked private space. Families slept together on straw mattresses or benches. Children shared beds, and animals sometimes slept inside for warmth. Privacy was minimal, yet social order demanded modesty and adherence to custom. Space constraints intensified discomfort, especially during illness or pregnancy. Sanitation inside homes was limited. Chamber pots were common, emptied outside. Streets and yards were often muddy, contaminated, and crowded. Bathing was rare, relying on rivers, streams, or occasional heated water. Dirt, sweat, and grime were part of daily life, accepted as natural. Exposure to cold water, rough surfaces, and contaminants increased the risk of illness. Storage was minimal. Food, tools, and clothing were kept in small spaces, often shared between family members. Grain might be stored in sacks, vegetables in pits, and meat smoked or salted. Rats and other pests were constant threats. Loss of stored food could mean hunger or starvation, emphasizing the fragility of domestic life. Weather dictated daily survival. Rain, wind, snow, and heat penetrated homes and clothing. Repairing roofs, reinforcing walls, or building small shelters required labor, often by entire families. Nature was both essential for survival and an ever-present threat. Crop damage, flooding and storms shaped the rhythm of life and labor. Social hierarchy influenced shelter and comfort. Wealthier families enjoyed larger stone homes, insulated with tapestries, wooden floors, and glass windows. Even here, life was not luxurious by modern standards. Drafts, manual lighting, and proximity to labor in spaces created constant awareness of fragility. Servants and workers endured greater hardships, sleeping in attics, barns, or minimal quarters. Animals were integrated into domestic life. Chickens, pigs, and dogs lived near or inside homes. They provided food, protection, and labor, but also contributed to noise, dirt, and disease. Maintaining animals required vigilance and added labor to already exhausting days. Daily labor began early. Children, women, and men prepared food, gathered fuel, repaired structures, and tended animals. Even leisure time was limited to brief moments in the evening or on rare holidays. Life was measured by the completion of essential tasks. Delays could result in hunger, exposure, or lost productivity. Meals were minimal and repetitive. Bread, porridge, and occasional vegetables were mainstays. Meat was rare for peasants, often reserved for special occasions. The combination of limited shelter, modest clothing, and monotonous food created a constant sense of deprivation. People adjusted, yet the struggle was continuous. Hunger, labor, and shelter were intertwined. Cold intensified hunger, making minimal food insufficient. Exhaustion from labor made simple survival tasks more difficult. Weakness increased vulnerability to disease and injury. Each day demanded endurance, awareness, and careful management of resources. Community life influenced daily living conditions. Villages often shared resources such as mills, ovens, or wells. Social obligations, festivals, and mutual aid shaped how space was used. Cooperation was essential for survival, yet scarcity reinforced competition. Social bonds were both supportive and fragile. Night brought some relief, but not comfort. Beds were shared, rooms were cold and damp, and sleep was interrupted by hunger, illness, or animals. Dreams were often overshadowed by practical concerns: the next day's labor, weather, and survival. Sleep offered only temporary escape from the relentless demands of daily life. Despite hardships, adaptation was remarkable. People learned to endure discomfort, optimize minimal resources, and maintain fragile homes. Skills in repair, crafting, and labor were passed through families. Knowledge of materials, weather, and nutrition shaped resilience. Survival required constant learning and quiet persistence. Hygiene, clothing, and shelter were inseparable from health and survival. Damp houses contributed to illness, poor clothing increased exposure, and lack of personal space allowed the spread of disease. The body and mind were trained to endure continuous discomfort, accepting a harsh reality as ordinary life. Even minor improvements were valuable. A repaired roof, a new layer of clothing, or a small stash of food offered relief. These small victories mattered profoundly, creating brief comfort in an otherwise relentless routine. Life was measured not by luxury but by the ability to continue adapt and endure daily hardship. The ordinary medieval home, its clothing and daily labor may seem unremarkable, yet they were central to survival. They shaped identity, skill, and endurance. Each day tested resilience, requiring physical effort, strategic thinking, and quiet patience. Comfort was secondary, persistence was essential. Thus, medieval life in shelter, clothing, and daily labor was a study in endurance. Small victories, communal cooperation, and adaptive skill allowed people to navigate cold, hunger, and discomfort. The ordinary rhythm of life was hard, repetitive, and unforgiving, but quietly human, full of resilience, and defined by persistence. In medieval times, work was constant, unyielding, and inseparable from survival. Labor was not a choice, it was a necessity that shaped every aspect of life. From peasants in the countryside to craftsmen in towns, the rhythm of the day was dictated by tasks that had to be completed to feed the family, maintain property, and fulfill social obligations. There was little room for leisure. And every day required endurance, patience, and careful management of strength and time. The majority of the population were peasants who labored on the land. Fields required tending year-round. Spring brought plowing, planting, and sowing seeds. Summer demanded weeding, watering, and protecting crops from pests. Autumn was the harvest, a grueling period where every hand was needed to gather grain, vegetables, and fruits before frost or rain ruined them. Winter, though slower in agriculture, brought maintenance work, repairing roofs, fences, tools, and preparing firewood. Men, women, and children contributed according to their strength and age. Men usually performed the heaviest tasks, plowing, felling trees, building, and tending livestock. Women managed domestic labor alongside agricultural work, cooking, cleaning, mending, and helping in fields. Children were taught responsibility early, contributing to work as soon as they were able, ensuring the household could function. Tools were simple and heavy. Wooden plows, sickles, spades, and rakes demanded physical effort. Oxen, horses, and other animals assisted, but human labor remained central. Muscle and endurance determined success. Mistakes were costly. Damaged crops could mean hunger, lost labor, and increased vulnerability to scarcity. Trades and crafts were another facet of labor. Blacksmiths, weavers, potters, and carpenters worked with skill, precision, and physical strength. Guilds regulated craft, ensuring standards but also enforcing strict rules and obligations. Work was long, repetitive, and often exhausting. Apprentices began young, learning craft through observation and hands-on experience. Mistakes were punished and perfection was expected. Markets and trade provided opportunities and additional burdens. Farmers, craftsmen, and merchants transported goods to town markets. Roads were poor, travel was risky, and weather could delay trade. Merchants faced competition, theft, and unpredictable demand. Markets were social and economic hubs. But participation required effort and careful planning. Labor was intertwined with social hierarchy. Lords, clergy, and wealthier citizens delegated or demanded labor. Tithes, taxes, and rent required peasants to provide a portion of their produce or work. Obligations could be exacting. Failure to meet labor demands or pay dues could result in punishment, shame, or loss of property. Authority dictated how labor was performed, how much and by whom. Seasonal cycles dictated work intensity. Spring and autumn were busiest. Summer brought exhaustion from heat, insects, and long hours. Winter, though slower, required preparation, food preservation, repair of tools and homes, and tending animals in harsh conditions. Labor never fully ceased, even in harsh weather. Even within households, work was constant. Cooking was a multi-step process: grinding grain, kneading bread, preparing vegetables, and tending fires. Cleaning required sweeping, washing with limited water, and removing waste. Clothing had to be mended or patched repeatedly. Food had to be stored or preserved for months. Every task consumed energy, attention, and time. Child labor was both education and necessity. Boys learned craft or fieldwork, girls learned domestic skills, childcare, and farm assistance. Play existed in small bursts, usually after completing essential tasks. Learning through labor prepared children for adulthood and the relentless demands of survival. Work was exhausting, yet it defined identity. People were valued for endurance, skill, and reliability. Laziness or inability was punished socially, economically, or physically. The quiet struggle of daily labor shaped character, resilience, and community reputation. Physical exhaustion was inevitable. Blisters, sores, sunburn, frostbite, and fatigue were constant. People learned to adapt, pacing themselves, sharing labor, and resting briefly when possible. Endurance became instinctive, a survival passed across generations. Trade extended labor beyond immediate survival. Farmers and craftsmen depended on markets to sell surplus and acquire essential goods. Travel required preparation, timing, and careful handling of products. Weather, bandits, and road conditions added risk. Every journey demanded vigilance and endurance. The monotony of labor could weigh heavily on the mind. Repetition, physical strain, and limited reward created mental fatigue. Yet small achievements, successful harvest, crafted tool or sold goods offered relief, satisfaction, and hope. Work, though exhausting, provided structure, purpose, and a measure of control in an otherwise unpredictable life. Communities cooperated to manage labor. Villages organized collective tasks, plowing, harvesting, or building structures. Social bonds were strengthened by shared effort, yet scarcity sometimes created tension. Disputes over resources, labor contributions, or shared obligations were common, requiring negotiation and compromise. Even wealthier citizens were not exempt from labor entirely. Lords and merchants oversaw estates, managed accounts, and coordinated trade. Though physical toil was reduced, mental effort, responsibility, and risk management created different pressures. Success or failure could affect many lives, binding labor to social responsibility. Fatigue was compounded by poor nutrition and harsh conditions. Meals were often insufficient for energy demands. Cold, heat, and dampness sapped strength. Illness or minor injuries slowed work, increasing vulnerability. Every day required careful balance between exertion and preservation of energy. Labor extended into religious and civic obligations. Church construction, festival preparation, and civic maintenance required additional effort. Work was both economic necessity and social duty. Failure to participate could result in social disapproval or loss of privilege. Even moments of rest were limited. Evening offered brief respite, but people remained alert for danger, illness, or preparation for the next day. Sleep was essential but often interrupted by hunger, noise, or discomfort. Recovery was partial, yet essential for enduring repetitive, exhausting labor. In medieval life, work was the framework of existence. Labor defined days, seasons, and life stages. Hunger, health, social obligation, and survival depended on persistent, careful, and quiet effort. Life was repetitive, challenging, and exhausting. But the persistence of labor enabled survival, small successes, and the continuation of communities. Quiet endurance, skill, and adaptation were the hallmarks of survival. Daily labor, though monotonous and harsh, shaped resilience, identity, and the rhythm of life. Medieval people understood that without work, there was no food, no shelter, no protection. Labor was life, and life was labor. Even amid hardship, people found moments of satisfaction: a field properly plowed, bread baked without waste, tools maintained, or a market sale completed. These small victories punctuated an otherwise relentless cycle, providing quiet encouragement and the faintest measure of comfort. Thus, medieval life was defined by labor, endless, exhausting, and unrelenting. It was not glamorous, heroic, or easy. It was persistent, adaptive, and profoundly human. Work was survival, endurance, and identity. shaping every aspect of existence in a world where comfort was rare, and perseverance was essential. Food in medieval times was both precious and scarce. Survival depended on careful planning, seasonal rhythms, and constant labor. Hunger was a quiet, persistent companion, shaping life from childhood to old age. The struggle for sustenance defined daily routines, relationships, and even the social structure of villages and towns. Peasants relied on a diet dominated by grains: wheat, rye, barley, and oats. Bread was the staple of life, often coarse and dense. Flour was ground by hand or using community mills, a laborious process that consumed time and energy. The quality of bread reflected social status. Wealthier households enjoyed finer white bread, while peasants subsisted on darker, coarser loaves. Vegetables were seasonal and basic: onions, cabbage, beans, and root vegetables formed the core of meals. Fruits were rare, often preserved through drying or fermentation to last through winter. Herbs were used sparingly to flavor food, offering small moments of taste in otherwise monotonous diets. Meat was a luxury. Peasants consumed it occasionally, often during festivals, religious holidays, or after successful hunts. Fish was more common, especially for communities near rivers or coasts, or during periods of religious fasting when meat was forbidden. Preservation was difficult, so consumption had to be timely and careful. Salted, smoked, or dried meat helped extend availability, but spoilage was ever present. Cooking required skill and time. Open hearths demanded constant attention. Pots simmered slowly, soup stirred, and bread baked in clay ovens. Fuel, often wood or peat, had to be gathered from forests or purchased, adding labor to already exhausting routines. Cooking was not leisure, it was survival. Famine was a constant threat. Weather, disease, and pests could destroy crops quickly. Droughts, floods, and late frosts caused shortages. When food failed, hunger became severe, and malnutrition weakened the population. Survival required resourcefulness, careful rationing, and sometimes the painful practice of consuming lesser, quality foods or foraging for wild plants. Food scarcity shaped social hierarchy. Lords and wealthy merchants could survive famine more easily, using stored grain, livestock, or wealth to maintain sustenance. Peasants bore the brunt of scarcity, sometimes facing starvation, migration, or increased labor obligations to make up for lost produce. Hunger reinforced dependence on authority. Daily meals were minimal and repetitive. Breakfast was often porridge or bread, lunch a simple stew or more bread, and dinner another modest meal. Nutrition was limited, and calories were often insufficient for the physical demands of labor. Malnourishment weakened bodies, increasing susceptibility to disease and injury. Children experienced hunger acutely. Their small bodies required nourishment, but access was limited by scarcity and family prioritization. Mealtime was also education. Learning to ration, share, and endure. Hunger shaped temperament, patience, and awareness of scarcity from an early age. Famine influenced social and economic behavior. People bartered, sold, or shared food strategically. Theft and poaching became survival strategies, punishable yet sometimes necessary. Communities adapted by pooling resources, sharing labor, or negotiating access to common lands. Cooperation was essential, yet scarcity could create tension, disputes, and quiet resentment. Religious practices shaped diet. Fasting days, feasts, and holy observances dictated consumption. Lent, for example, forbade meat for extended periods, forcing reliance on fish, legumes, or bread. Religious obligations intersected with survival needs, adding complexity to already limited guidance. Faith provided guidance, reassurance, and structure even as hunger persisted. Storage and preservation were constant concerns. Grain, vegetables, and meat were stored in small granaries, pits, or cellars. Spoilage, rodents, and insects threatened supplies. Every decision about storing, consuming, or trading food could affect survival. Efficiency, foresight, and vigilance were essential daily skills. Labor was intimately tied to food production. Every task from plowing to harvesting influenced the next meal. Poor harvests meant less food, More work in the fields was necessary to compensate. Women's domestic labor ensured that limited ingredients were stretched to feed the family. Cooking, preserving, and planning were continuous tasks, essential for survival. Markets and trade provided additional access to food but required effort. Travel to sell produce or buy essentials was risky and laborious. Weather, road conditions and bandits threatened supplies. Prices fluctuated, influenced by scarcity, season and social demand. Trade was essential but survival often depended on careful timing and negotiation. Famine had emotional and psychological effects. Anxiety about food availability influenced social interaction, decision-making and behavior. Hunger affected patience, endurance and resilience. Families adapted quietly, enduring stress while maintaining routine tasks, illustrating the quiet persistence of medieval life. Food also shaped relationships. Sharing meals reinforced social bonds. Neighbors helped one another during scarcity, but jealousy and tension could arise over perceived inequalities. Hospitality was both a moral and practical duty, balancing survival with social expectations. Even brief abundance provided relief and joy. A successful harvest, a rare piece of meat, or sweet fruit could lift spirits, strengthen bodies and provide hope. These moments were fleeting, yet deeply cherished. Life was measured in small victories over hunger and scarcity. Children learned practical lessons early: how to forage, identify edible plants, and conserve supplies. These skills were essential for survival. They observed adults' careful management of food, learning endurance, patience, and resourcefulness. Life education was inseparable from the daily struggle for sustenance. Health and nutrition were deeply connected. Hunger weakened immune systems, slowed recovery from injury, and increased susceptibility to disease. Labor was exhausting. Yet insufficient nutrition amplified fatigue. Survival required a delicate balance between effort and energy conservation. Even in the wealthier households, diet was controlled by availability and season. Imported goods were rare, spices expensive, and preservation techniques limited. Daily consumption reflected practicality more than desire. In all households, food scarcity demanded careful planning, routine and adaptation. Meals were social, educational, and practical. Eating together reinforced family bonds, taught children discipline, and provided structure to the day. Food scarcity intensified appreciation. Every meal mattered, waste was unacceptable. Even small portions were cherished, eaten slowly and mindfully. The struggle for sustenance defined medieval existence. Life was an endless cycle of labor, preparation, and careful consumption. Hunger was a background constant, guiding effort, shaping relationship, and influencing survival strategies. Every decision, from planting to storage, affected the likelihood of enduring another season. Despite hardships, medieval people adapted. Resourcefulness, knowledge of land and crops, and communal cooperation allowed survival. Small victories, fresh bread, preserved vegetables, or a successful trade, offered relief. Life was harsh, repetitive, and exhausting, yet these small successes kept families alive. Thus, medieval food and famine illustrate the quiet misery and endurance of everyday life. Hunger was never far away. Labor, planning, and vigilance were essential. Yet even in scarcity, moments of relief, sharing, and small abundance provided glimpses of comfort, shaping resilience, skill, and quiet persistence. In medieval times, access to clean water and sanitation was limited, shaping daily life in quiet but profound ways. Water was essential, not just for drinking, but for cooking, cleaning, bathing, and caring for animals. Yet obtaining it required effort, planning and constant attention, and even then, contamination was common. Life revolved around the management of this precious resource. Wells were central to villages. Those who lived near wells had more convenient access, but many households relied on rivers, streams, or collected rainwater. Water had to be transported in heavy buckets, often over long distances, multiple times a day. Children and women frequently carried the burden, navigating uneven terrain or dangerous paths. Every drop mattered, shaping daily routines and labor priorities. Contamination was constant. Wells could be polluted by runoff, waste, or nearby latrines. Rivers and streams carried not only drinking water, but also the refuse of nearby households, livestock, and industries. Even seemingly clean water could harbor invisible pathogens, spreading disease silently. People did not understand germs, so they relied on experience, observation, and traditional methods to judge safety. Bathing was rare and time-consuming. Full body washing required heating water over fires, collecting it in tubs, and enduring cold drafts during the process. For many, weekly or monthly baths were a luxury. Most cleaning occurred through spot washing, hands, face, and sometimes limbs. Soap was limited, often homemade from animal fat and ashes, and its use was inconsistent. Personal hygiene was constrained by practicality rather than choice. Sanitation in homes and towns was rudimentary. Chamber pots were emptied into streets, rivers, or pits. Waste contaminated the environment, contributing to foul smells, vermin, and disease. Streets, yards, and marketplaces were often muddy and unsanitary. Flies and other pests thrived in these conditions, spreading illness quietly yet relentlessly. Animal husbandry compounded challenges. Chickens, pigs, and livestock shared living spaces with humans, contributing waste but providing essential food and labor. Proximity to animals increased exposure to pathogens, parasites, and zoonotic diseases. Managing animals required careful attention, yet complete separation was impossible. Survival demanded constant vigilance. Water was essential for cooking and food preparation. Grain had to be soaked or ground, soups boiled, and vegetables washed. Contaminated water threatened health, so people learned to observe clarity, temperature, and taste. Boiling was practiced when possible, though fuel scarcity made it a careful calculation. Every culinary task involved negotiation with risk, requiring attention and patience. In towns, public wells and fountains were central to survival. Crowds, trade, and communal use increased the risk of contamination. People managed this risk quietly, observing who had used the water, how long it had been standing, and whether it appeared clean. Hygiene was intertwined with social observation and careful decision-making. Waste disposal was a constant challenge. Human and animal waste, household refuse, and spoiled food all had to be managed with limited technology. Pit latrines were common in rural areas, while urban centers sometimes had more structured systems, though imperfect. Streets often doubled as drainage channels, carrying contamination into homes, fields, and water sources. Disease spread silently through water and sanitation deficiencies. Dysentery, cholera, and other gastrointestinal illnesses were common. Even minor diarrhea or vomiting could weaken individuals, particularly children and the elderly. Illnesses caused by contaminated water were unpredictable, frustrating, and often fatal. Prevention relied on careful observation, superstition, and trial and error experience. Communities developed informal methods to cope. Certain water sources were deemed safer, wells were sometimes blessed or enclosed. Filtration using cloth, boiling, and reliance on perceived purity were practiced. Rituals, prayers, and traditional knowledge complemented observation, providing structure, reassurance, and partial protection. Daily labor intersected with water management. Fields, gardens, livestock, and households all required water. Work schedules were dictated by availability, season, and the distance to water sources. Long days were spent fetching, carrying, and distributing water, with interruptions for household needs and emergencies. Water shaped time, effort, and the rhythm of daily life. Children learned these tasks early. Fetching water became part of education and survival training. They observed how elders judged water quality, balanced labor with nutrition, and mitigated risk. Skill in managing water resources became an essential aspect of childhood responsibility, instilling endurance, observation, and adaptability. Sanitation failures had social consequences. Unclean homes or streets reflected poorly on families, inviting criticism, exclusion, or punishment. Hygiene was intertwined with morality and reputation. People learned to maintain minimal standards, balancing effort, resources and social expectations. Even minimal hygiene carried effort. Washing clothes required heated water, laborious scrubbing, and drying. Preservation of clothing depended on cleanliness, repair, and careful management. Labor and sanitation were inseparable, shaping survival and quality of life. Illness, hygiene, and labor intersected in cycles of vulnerability. Contaminated water could lead to illness, weakening individuals, reducing labor capacity, and threatening survival. Households and communities adapted strategies, sharing tasks, teaching children, and observing patterns of risk. Endurance became a learned, quiet skill. Weather amplified challenges. Rainwater collection could supplement scarcity, but storms damaged storage, flooded homes, and spread contamination. Droughts limited availability, forcing longer journeys and rationing. Seasonal awareness was critical, influencing labor, nutrition, and health. Faith and ritual intersected with sanitation practices. Water was sometimes blessed, wells dedicated to saints, or purification rituals observed before consumption. Belief in divine protection provided psychological comfort, guiding behavior in the absence of scientific understanding. Prayer, blessing and ritual supplemented observation and effort. Even moments of apparent comfort carried risk. Drinking from a spring, washing hands before meals, or collecting rainwater were daily negotiations with potential danger. Life required constant attention, patience, and endurance. Every task, no matter how ordinary, had consequences for health and survival. Hygiene and water management shaped social life. Shared wells and public spaces required cooperation. Disputes over access, contamination, or responsibility arose quietly, resolved through negotiation, custom, or authority. Social bonds and tension coexisted, influencing survival strategies and community cohesion. Despite these challenges, medieval people adapted remarkably. Observation, experience, and quiet learning allowed survival. Children grew into adults skilled in managing water, labor, and hygiene. Families endured harsh conditions, navigating risk, scarcity, and physical hardship. Adaptation was not dramatic, it was persistent, patient, and quiet. Clothing in medieval times was far more than a matter of style, it was a daily necessity, a reflection of survival, labor, and social hierarchy. Unlike modern life, garments were primarily practical, designed to protect the body from cold, damp, and exposure, while signaling status, occupation, and community standing. The effort involved in creating, maintaining, and wearing clothes defined daily life in quiet yet profound ways. For peasants, clothing was simple and functional. Garments were made from coarse wool or linen, materials that were durable but often uncomfortable. Tunics, leggings, cloaks, and simple dresses formed the core of everyday attire. These clothes were layered to protect against cold and dampness, especially during long, harsh winters. Every patch, every repair reflected necessity and endurance. Sewing, mending, and care were essential daily tasks. Women, in particular, managed clothing maintenance. Patches extended the life of worn garments, and hand-stitched repairs prevented exposure to cold or embarrassment in social settings. Children wore hand-me-downs. Often ill-fitting or frayed, yet these garments were essential for protection and survival. Wool was the primary fabric for warmth, but it required preparation. Sheep had to be sheared, wool cleaned, spun, and woven. Each step demanded skill, labor, and patience. Families often managed production themselves, or relied on local weavers, making clothing both a product of labor and a symbol of resourcefulness. Linen was lighter and used for undergarments, but it required careful maintenance. Washing, bleaching, and mending consumed time and energy. Soap, often made from animal fat and ash, was used sparingly. Water scarcity, physical labor, and exposure to the elements meant that cleanliness was a careful balance, rarely fully achieved. Footwear was minimal. Simple leather shoes, often thin-soled, protected feet from rough terrain, cold, and injury. Children and laborers frequently wore shoes with holes or shared shoes between siblings. walking long distances for work, water, or trade required endurance and careful attention to prevent injury. Social hierarchy was evident in clothing. Wealthy individuals wore garments made from finer materials, dyed with expensive colors, and adorned with embroidery or jewelry. Layers of tunics, robes, and cloaks displayed status, but also demanded labor to maintain. Even for the rich, clothing was not effortless. Care, washing, and repair required attention and management of household labor. Fashion, though present, was secondary to function. Trends in color, cut, and decoration were observed, but practicality remained paramount. Fabrics had to withstand daily tasks, exposure to weather, and long hours of labor. Clothing was a reflection of survival, endurance, and social signaling. Children learned about clothing early. Dressing, mending, and managing layers were part of education and survival training. They observed adults balancing warmth, hygiene, and social propriety, learning patience, skill, and endurance. Clothing shaped identity, behavior, and social awareness from a young age. Weather dictated clothing choices. Heavy rains, cold winds, and snow required additional layers. Summers demanded lighter garments but still protection from sun, insects, and work-related hazards. People adapted quietly, balancing comfort, protection, and labor demands. Seasonal change required adjustments in production, repair, and usage of clothing. Labor was intertwined with clothing maintenance. Fieldwork, domestic chores, and trade damaged garments. Continuous repair, washing, and protection were essential. Clothing reflected physical effort. Dirt, sweat, and wear demonstrated daily endurance and adaptation. The simple act of dressing was, therefore, an ongoing labor-intensive practice. Hygiene challenges extended to clothing. Limited washing led to odors, parasites, and wear. Layers trapped sweat and grime, yet provided essential insulation. People adapted to discomfort, tolerating smells and stiffness as natural parts of daily life. Adaptation was both practical and psychological, shaping resilience and patience. Seasonal rituals, festivals, and religious observances influenced clothing. Special garments were worn during feasts, ceremonies, and holidays. Even brief occasions of festivity demanded preparation, repair, and attention to detail. Social observation and expectation reinforced the quiet labor involved in managing clothing. Trade and market access influenced clothing availability. Dyed fabrics, imported materials, and new styles could be obtained by those with resources. Market participation required time, effort, and negotiation. Clothing became both functional and symbolic, reflecting connections, trade access, and social status. Economic limitations shaped creativity. Peasants patched garments meticulously, used natural dyes, and repurposed old fabrics. Scarcity encouraged resourcefulness, skill, and patience. Every worn garment told a story of labor, adaptation, and survival. Physical discomfort was constant. Coarse fabrics, tight bindings, and multiple layers restricted movement. Footwear could cause blisters or injury. Children, laborers, and even some adults in discomfort daily, adjusting tasks, posture, and labor to accommodate clothing limitations. Endurance was both bodily and mental. Hunger, illness, and labor intersected with clothing. Malnutrition weakened the body, increasing susceptibility to cold, damp, and injury. Clothing was the first line of defense, yet it could only partially protect. Each layer, repair, and adaptation contributed to survival, demonstrating quiet persistence and practical intelligence. Communities shared knowledge about clothing management. Techniques for mending, washing, and preservation were passed orally. Skills were observed, taught, and refined, creating continuity and resilience. Clothing knowledge was essential for survival, subtly shaping cultural continuity. Even minimal improvements offered relief. A new garment, repaired shoe, or freshly washed tunic provided comfort, warmth, and dignity. These small victories were appreciated quietly, offering a break from constant labor, discomfort, and vigilance. Life was measured not by luxury, but by the ability to endure daily challenges with skill and patience. Faith and ritual intersected with clothing. Religious garments, ceremonial robes, and prayer attire were maintained carefully. Clothing was not only practical but symbolic, marking devotion status and participation in communal life. Careful attention to appearance, even within scarcity, reinforced cultural and social cohesion. The quiet struggle with clothing, maintenance, and adaptation shaped identity. People defined themselves by resilience, skill, and ability to endure discomfort. Clothing was a daily reflection of labor, resourcefulness, and survival. Life required attention to detail, patience, and practical intelligence. Childbirth and infancy in medieval times were fraught with quiet danger and persistent uncertainty. Life began not with ease but with risk, shaping families, communities, and the rhythm of survival. The fragility of both mother and child defined daily life, influencing labor, household routines, and social structures in subtle, relentless ways. Pregnancy carried significant risk. Medical knowledge was rudimentary and complications were common. Women relied on midwives, family members, and herbal remedies to support labor, manage pain, and attempt safe delivery. Advice combined experience, superstition, and tradition. Faith offered guidance and reassurance. Yet survival depended largely on physical endurance, careful observation, and quiet courage. Labor could be long and arduous. Women endured pain without modern analgesics, supported by midwives or female relatives. The home environment was often basic: a straw mattress, limited sanitation, and minimal tools for assistance. Animals sometimes shared space for warmth, further complicating hygiene. Comfort was minimal, yet every effort mattered. Infant mortality was high. Many children did not survive beyond the first year due to infection, malnutrition, or complications during birth. Families lived with quiet grief, understanding that loss was common and survival uncertain. Those who survived were often resilient, shaped by early hardship and attentive care. Breastfeeding was essential but not always sufficient. Wet nurses were sometimes employed by wealthier families, while poorer households relied entirely on the mother. Nutrition of both mother and child influenced survival. Limited food, illness, and exhaustion could affect milk quality, leaving infants vulnerable. Care of infants required constant attention. Washing, feeding, and protection from exposure were daily tasks. Homes were drafty, floors cold, and bedding shared with adults or animals, increasing risk of infection. Vigilance was essential, and failure to maintain routine could have immediate consequences. Traditional remedies were common. Herbs, poultices, and rituals were applied for ailments, teething, or digestive issues. Midwives relied on observation and practical experience, providing care that was partly effective and partly a product of cultural knowledge. Remedies offered hope, reassurance, and occasional relief, even if results were inconsistent. Children were exposed early to the harsh realities of life. Hunger, labor, illness, and environmental danger were constant companions. Education was practical survival skills. Observation and participation in household tasks taught children endurance, patience, and adaptation. Play existed, but often alongside responsibility. Siblings shared care and responsibility. Older children helped with feeding, cleaning, and protecting younger siblings. Tasks were part of informal apprenticeship in life skills. Social bonds were strengthened by shared labor, grief, and resilience. Cooperation was essential, as survival depended on collective effort. Medical intervention was limited. Complications during birth could be fatal for mother or child. Infection was common and hygiene minimal. Midwives provided guidance, faith, and practical support, but outcomes were uncertain. Every birth involved negotiation with risk, patience, and courage. Diet shaped early life. Infants and young children were vulnerable to malnutrition, limited access to quality food, scarcity, and seasonal fluctuations affected growth and health. Families managed resources carefully, balancing labor needs and nutrition. Hunger during early years had long-term consequences, influencing strength, endurance, and susceptibility to disease. Communities provided support during childbirth, neighbors, family, and clergy often assisted, offering food, labor, or guidance. Shared knowledge and experience created quiet networks of care. Support mitigated risk but could not eliminate it. Survival depended on adaptation, vigilance, and communal cooperation. Sanitation intersected with infancy. Unclean floors, limited washing, and animal proximity increased risk of infection. Parents managed exposure through observation, isolation of the sick, and careful attention to hygiene within limited means. Life was a constant negotiation with risk. Education began early. Children learned through observation, participation, and imitation. Skills for cooking, washing, gathering water, tending animals, and craft were integrated into daily life. Survival demanded early mastery of practical skills, shaping resilience and patience. Faith played a central role. Blessings, prayers, and rituals offered protection during pregnancy, birth, and infancy. Religious guidance provided comfort and structure, intertwining spiritual practice with physical survival. Belief offered reassurance in the face of uncertainty, reinforcing patience and quiet endurance. Despite constant risk, families adapted. Careful attention, practical experience, and communal support allowed many children to survive. Skills were transmitted quietly, patiently, and persistently. The cycle of life, frailty, and endurance shaped identity, expectation, and household routines. Environmental hazards added to the challenge. Cold, damp, pests, and disease created constant threats to infants. Families adapted by layering clothing, maintaining fires, and carefully observing the surroundings. Vigilance was quiet but relentless, essential for survival. Loss and grief were woven into daily life. Families mourned quietly, often continuing labor and household duties while experiencing sorrow. Acceptance of mortality created a culture of resilience and patient endurance, where life's fragility was understood intimately. Even brief moments of comfort mattered profoundly. A healthy meal, a warm fire, or successful recovery from illness provided relief. These small victories were deeply cherished, offering hope and energy for continued labor and vigilance. In medieval times, illness was a quiet, pervasive force, shaping daily life in ways both subtle and relentless. People lived with the constant possibility of disease, from minor fevers to deadly plagues. Medical knowledge was limited, and the line between life and death often depended on endurance, observation, and patience rather than skill or science. The understanding of disease was rudimentary. Germs, bacteria, and viruses were unknown. People explained illness through imbalance of humors, divine punishment, or exposure to bad air. Treatments were guided by observation, tradition, and superstition rather than empirical science. Knowledge was passed orally, through experience, or in rare medical texts accessible mainly to the wealthy or clergy. Common illnesses included fevers, respiratory infections, gastrointestinal problems, and wounds that refused to heal. Even minor injuries could become life-threatening. Without antiseptics or antibiotics, infections spread silently, weakening the body and threatening survival. People adapted quietly, observing symptoms, isolating the sick, and relying on herbal remedies. Plagues were a terrifying reality. The Black Death and smaller outbreaks demonstrated how quickly disease could strike entire communities. Fear-shaped behavior. People avoided crowded spaces, relied on charms and prayers, and sought distance from the afflicted. Knowledge was limited, so prevention was often ritualistic or based on anecdote rather than efficacy. Treatment was a combination of herbal medicine, prayer, and manual care. Herbs were used for poultices, teas, and ointments. Midwives, barber, surgeons, and wise women provided care, though outcomes were inconsistent. Techniques like bloodletting, cupping, and leeching were common, applied in the belief of restoring balance. Some treatments offered relief, others caused harm. Illness affected all members of society. Peasants endured physical hardship alongside sickness, often continuing labor despite fever or weakness. Wealthy individuals had access to better care. But even privilege did not guarantee survival. Urban populations faced additional risk from crowded conditions and contaminated water. Disease was indiscriminate, though social conditions influenced vulnerability. Childhood and infancy were particularly vulnerable periods. Children were susceptible to infections and malnutrition. Parents relied on observation, midwives, and traditional remedies to protect and treat young wives. Education about illness began early, teaching children to recognize symptoms, avoid contamination, and participate in care. Survival depended on collective vigilance. Hygiene was intimately connected with health. Limited bathing, dirty clothing, and contaminated water contributed to illness. People managed exposure carefully, though complete prevention was impossible. Simple practices, washing hands, boiling water, cleaning utensils were crucial yet constrained by effort and resources. Hospital care existed but was limited. Early hospitals, often associated with monasteries, provided food, shelter, and rudimentary treatment. Care focused on comfort and spiritual support rather than effective medical intervention. The sick were observed, fed, and tended, but cures were rare. Surviving illness required patience, adaptation, and endurance. Fever, chills, and pain were common. People endured these quietly, relying on rest, warm clothing, herbal remedies, and limited nourishment. Recovery was slow, and even minor illnesses could disrupt daily labor, weaken the body, and increase vulnerability to other health threats. Endurance was both physical and psychological. Nutrition played a central role in health. Malnourished individuals were more susceptible to illness. Scarcity of food, labor demands, and seasonal fluctuations affected immunity and recovery. Families managed diet carefully, stretching available resources to maintain strength. Small improvements in nutrition could mean the difference between survival and death. Social bonds influenced care. Neighbors, family members, and community members shared labor, observation, and assistance. Watching the sick, preparing food, and maintaining the household were acts of quiet endurance. Support networks were crucial, as survival depended on collective effort, vigilance, and cooperation. Superstition and belief were inseparable from medicine. Charms, prayers, and ritual offerings were common treatments. Illness was often attributed to divine punishment, moral failing, or supernatural causes. Faith offered psychological comfort, guidance, and structure, helping individuals endure uncertainty and fear. Work and illness intersected continuously. Labor could exacerbate conditions while sickness reduced productivity. Adults worked despite weakness to maintain survival, while children took on responsibilities to support households. Life was a delicate balance between effort, care, and vulnerability. The body itself was fragile. Repeated exposure to infection, exhaustion, and poor nutrition made recovery slow. Even minor fevers could leave lasting weakness. People learned to manage fatigue, conserve energy, and adapt routines to maintain endurance. Observation skill and quiet resilience were essential. Community awareness was vital. Recognizing symptoms, isolating the sick, and sharing remedies were strategies that allowed survival. Knowledge was both communal and experiential. Success in coping with illness depended on careful observation, patience, and attention to detail. Environmental factors amplified risk. Cold, dampness, contaminated water, and overcrowding contributed to disease prevalence. Homes, streets, and fields were constant sources of potential infection. Life demanded awareness, careful hygiene, and practical adaptation. Even small recoveries were celebrated quietly. The survival of a child, the healing of a wound, or relief from persistent fever offered hope, renewed energy, and reassurance. Life was fragile, yet moments of relief reinforced resilience and endurance. Medical failures were common. People understood that not all illness could be treated, and death was a constant companion. Acceptance of mortality was part of daily life, shaping behavior, expectations, and social structures. Endurance, rather than cure, became a central principle of survival. Despite limited knowledge, adaptation was remarkable. Families and communities developed practical skills, observed patterns of disease, and implemented simple preventive measures. Survival was often a quiet, patient negotiation with the limits of understanding, resources, and endurance.